بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أكرم الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. We're moving on now, swimming more deeply in the waters of what turns out to be a complex but undeniably vital study, namely the question of intention. Our actions are easier to understand than our reasons for our actions. The actions are outward, measurable, can be captured on camera. What we mean by those actions is something that very often we ourselves may not understand or be able to define. And we saw in the previous lectures that really the purpose of Imam Ghazali's revival of the religious sciences is to give us a new optic whereby we can look beneath the surface of religion. Religion, rather like the world itself, has a surface and has depths. If one can spend one's entire life looking at the surface of the world and not discerning what lies beneath it and what is the nature of its being, rather like looking at a lake. You can see its surface, but if you know exactly how to look at it and from which angle, when the sun is inclining on it in the right way, you can amazingly see beneath the surface of the lake. And so it is with the matters of religion. There are outward and there are inward horizons. And the Imam's purpose in this book really is to force us to recognize the primacy of the inward. The outward is not valid unless it has a due purpose. And intentionality, as we have seen, is represented in the very first hadith of Islam, إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ, actions are according to their intentions. We need to recall at some point that the Imam's treatment in this particular book, the book of intention and ikhlas and sidq, is to look at the, as it were, sacral, qibla-oriented validity of our actions. Are they acceptable to Rabb al-Alameen? And what it's not doing is looking at their formal validity, which is something else. And the ulama have often distinguished between different types of niyyah, of intention. To what extent, when we engage in certain legal practices, is the validity of that practice dependent upon having entered upon that practice for the right reason. And this in every jurisprudential culture becomes an important topic. One of the great thinkers on this was the Maliki thinker of the Middle Ages, Imam Shihabuddin al-Qarafi, rahmatullahi alayh, who has a book called Idrakul Umniyya, which is really all about intention and the different kinds of intention. And the intentions which determine ibadat, acts of pure religious worship, hajj, fasting, prayer, and so forth, we always describe as niyyah, and they determine a validity invisibly. The mu'amalat, however, other areas of the sharia, such as contract law, such as inheritance, such as criminal law, such as property law, are different insofar as even in the absence of an intention, they can still be religiously valid. And very often the ulama will not use the word niyyah for those practices, but other terms like qasd and irada, intention, purpose, intent. And indeed, Imam al-Qarafi says this is the best way of distinguishing between the ibadat and the mu'amalat, and this becomes an issue for the fuqaha. So in Islamic jurisprudential culture, which is a profoundly ethical culture, as a generalization we can say that intention carries more weight in determining legality and in the enforcement of rulings in a court of law in Sharia than it does in contemporary Western law, even though Western law has this thing called intent usually. The lawyers call it intent rather than intention. So that in US law, for instance, there's first-degree murder, there's second-degree murder, there's even non-culpable homicide. The event seems to be the same, but because of the difference of intent, the ruling is going to be very different. And Every legal system has to acknowledge that. If I deliberately poison my neighbour, that can't carry the same penalty as if I throw something out of the window of a train and it hits somebody, or if I kill somebody in order to defend myself or to defend my family. It's different. But in a court of law, generally, the Sharia, which is very contextual and also focused very much on the judge and the judge's insight, we find that it is easy for a judge to sentence or to acquit on the basis of what is taken to be intentionality in Islamic law than in Western law. This is often something that people don't understand. They think Islamic law is statutory law, like the law of the West, but that's not the case. But of course, so for instance, in contracts in Sharia, there's huge discussion about different types of contracts and where they're valid and where they aren't. A contract may contain a clause that nobody really meant to be there under certain circumstances. Something happens that wasn't envisaged when the two parties determined on the conditions of the contract. And in that case, if both of them agree on what's to be done, then there's no problem. The contract will not apply in any case. If one of them thinks, well, this is to my advantage, and the other thinks, well, I don't like this, and this is not what I intended, then the judge can actually rule on the basis of what was the clear overriding qasd or intention of the contract, and can override some of the small print. In our times, when we're always clicking I accept, thereby binding us by possibly pages and pages of really small print that comes out of some back office in Google or Microsoft. And even if we read it, we probably wouldn't understand it. It's one of the barbarisms of the modern world, really, is that we're bound by things that we don't know and that we don't understand. We're not really free as people are intended to be in Sharia. But it's actually very difficult to get out of those things, particularly if the other side has a big lawyer. So that's an example of how intentionality works differently. But in other issues, for instance, famously in the question of nikah, it's actually not required to have an intention for a contract of marriage in the madhabs to be valid. There was the famous case a couple of years ago in Pakistan where, as part of a stage drama, TV drama, there was a nikah in the studio. And the mullahs, when they heard about this and saw it, said they are actually married. And so this fancy actress discovered that she was actually married to this guy, and he was not her dream guy, and it became an issue. And but that is technically, depending on how you want to look at it, how it works. It's kind of automatic. It's strict liability. And the ulama will argue about why this should be the case. And sometimes they say, in Islam, marriage is meant to be very, very simple, so that people know exactly what they're getting themselves into. And as soon as you make it conditional upon some demonstrable or non-demonstrable intention, if the bloke says a week later, I didn't really mean it, and goes to the judge, and the judge rules on the basis of that intention, then no. So hazl, jesting, is not an exit clause from a nikah in Islamic law. So if you do a comedy with some friends, young students get together and they say, oh, I marry you, and there's two witnesses, that is a nikah, even if it's just part of a joke. The extent to which drunkenness comes into it is different amongst the madahib, intoxication. So that's another, and it's a very complex issue, the extent to which intention influences the legal enforceability of acts in Sharia. And it's complicated because human society is complicated, but generally the rule is it's not fundamentally dependent. So for instance, if I owe you 1,000 guineas and I pay it back, even if I don't intend anything by paying it back, the Sharia says you've paid back the law, and the judge doesn't need to get involved in intentionality, except in very rare and unusual circumstances. So that's a whole area of intention, niyyah, irada, qasd, which is clearly important in human society, but which is not the subject of the Imam's discussion in this book. He's looking at niyyah as it relates to the acceptability and the purity of act in the sight of God, not what is legally enforceable in wider society, and it's important to bear that in mind. So we reached the point at the end of the previous lecture where the Imam had been talking about different aspects of intention, and we finished the fourth bayan, and we're just about to embark upon the fifth of this first section. So there's three sections in the book: Niyyah, Ikhlas, Sidq, and we're coming towards the end of the book of intention as such, and the fifth bayan, exposition, is called Bayanun anna niyyata ghayra dakhila tahta al-ikhtiyar. We're left on this note, a cliffhanger, an exposition that intention is not subject to our choice. And that seems to hit at the basis of our humanity. If actions are by intentions, but I can't choose my intentions, then what am I? And the Imam is going to explain how this works, and it's a subtlety. But as we'll see, it's very fundamental to Islam's vision of how we reform ourselves. And the idea that just saying, I intend this, or saying, oh, I've decided to intend something else, affects only the surface of what we are, but doesn't get down into what we really mean by those things, which is where the divine judgment rests. So, اعلم أن الجاهل يسمع ما ذكرناه من الوصية بتحسين النية وتكثيرها مع قوله صلى الله عليه وسلم إنما الأعمال بالنيات. Know that an ignorant person, when he listens to everything that we've been saying by way of encouraging people to improve their intention and to have plenty of good intentions, and also the prophetic saying actions are by intentions, فيقول في نفسه عند تدريسه أو تجارته أو أكله, and he says when he's teaching or doing business or just eating something, نويت أن أدرس لله أو أتجر لله أو آكل لله. I make the intention of teaching for God, or doing this commercial transaction for the sake of God, or eating this food for the sake of God. ويظن أن ذلك نية, and he thinks that that is an intention. وهيهات, that's ridiculous. فذلك حديث النفس أو حديث لسان أو فكر أو انتقال من خاطر إلى خاطر. What that is, I intend to teach for God, is just a supposition of the self, or a stream of consciousness, or something that just comes, trips off the tongue, or an idea, or a movement from one passing notion to another. وَالنِّيَّةُ بِمَعْزَلٍ عَنْ جَمِيعِ ذَلِكَ. But intention is completely distinct from all of those things. وإنما النية انبعاث النفس وتوجهها وميلها إلى ما ظهر لها أن فيه غرضها. Intention is for the soul to rise up and to direct itself and to incline towards something which appears to it to be its purpose. So it's from deeper down. إما عاجلا أو آجلا, and that purpose can be this worldly or next worldly. والميل إذا لم يكن لا يمكن اختراعه واكتسابه بمجرد الإرادة. And this inclination, what we naturally want, if it's there, cannot just be invented or acquired simply by willing it to exist. بل ذلك كقول الشبعان نويت أن أشتهي الطعام وأميل إليه. Because that would be like the person who's just filled himself with food and is sated. I intend to desire food and to have an appetite for it. أو قول الفارغ نويت أن أعشق فلانا وأحبه وأعظمه بقلبي. Or somebody who's unattached, just suddenly to say, I intend to love so-and-so, and to have passion for so-and-so, and to magnify, to consider such a person to be really great. فَذَلِكَ مُحَالٌ, that is impossible. So you can't, what it's saying is, it comes from deeper than just words. You can't say, I decide, I intend to be hungry now. I intend to love somebody. I intend to respect somebody. Impossible. بل لا طريق إلى اكتساب صرف القلب إلى شيء وميله إليه وتوجهه نحوه إلا باكتساب أسبابه. There's no road, no way to making the heart shift from something and incline to something else and to orient itself towards it unless you acquire the factors behind that shift. In other words, you can't just say, move heart, love that person. You have to acquire the factors which will then make you love that person or desire that food. So it has to go deeper. وَذَلِكَ مِمَّا قَدْ يَقْدِرُ عَلَيْهِ وَقَدْ لَا يَقْدِرُ عَلَيْهِ. And this is something which we might be able to do and we might not be able to do. وإنما تنبعث النفس إلى الفعل إجابة للغرض الباعث الموافق للنفس الملائم لها. Because the self only inclines to an action in response to the purpose which corresponds to what the self wants and which is aligned with it. You can't say, I intend to like something when in fact the self doesn't like that thing. وما لم يعتقد الإنسان أن غرضه منوط بفعل من الأفعال, to the extent that a human being doesn't think that his purpose is connected to a particular action, فلا يتوجه نحوه قصده, then his purpose cannot be directed towards that action. وذلك مما لا يقدر على اعتقاده في كل حين. وإذا اعتقد فإنما يتوجه القلب إذا كان فارغا غير مصروف عنه بغرض شاغل أقوى منه. And it is not possible for us simply to concoct a belief at any moment. And when the belief exists, the heart will only have that intention on the basis of that belief. This is really good for me and suits what I want. If it is detached and not distracted from that thing by some other wish which is stronger than it. وذلك لا يمكن في كل وقت, and that's not possible in all times, at all times. والدواعي والصوارف لها أسباب كثيرة بها تجتمع. And the motives and the things that repel us from certain things have many, many reasons which must come together. ويختلف ذلك بالأشخاص وبالأحوال والأعمال. And this is going to depend on the individual and on the circumstances and on the actual actions. So the creation of the factors that will enable me to love somebody or to desire a particular kind of food or whatever else it might be is going to depend to some extent on my temperament, on the circumstances, and also on the type of action which the intention is directed to. فإذا غلبت شهوة النكاح مثلا ولم يعتقد غرضا صحيحا في الولد دينا ولا دنيا. So in the case of a person who feels a desire for marriage but does not have a sound belief concerning the purpose of having children in this which would benefit him in this world and in the next world, لا يمكنه أن يواقع على نية الولد. He cannot get married and cannot be with his wife with the intention of wanting children. بل لا يمكن إلا على نية قضاء الشهوة. It can only be with the intention of satisfying desire. إذ النية هي إجابة الباعث. Because the intention is the response to the motive. ولا باعث إلا الشهوة. And the motive here is simply appetite or desire. فكيف ينوي الولد? So how can such and such a person also be intending to have a child? وإذا لم يغلب على قلبه أن إقامة سنة النكاح اتباعا لرسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم يعظم فضلها. If he doesn't have in his heart the dominant thought that the establishment of the sunnah of the nikah in following the Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, whose merit is so amazing, if he doesn't really intend this aspect of the sunnah, لا يمكن أن ينوي بالنكاح اتباع السنة. He is not capable of intending through his marriage the following of the sunnah إلا أن يقول ذلك بلسانه وقلبه وهو حديث محض وليس بنية. He might say with his tongue and in his heart quietly to himself, he might be trying to persuade himself that I'm doing this for the sunnah, but this is just a stream of consciousness, it's just words, it's not an intention. So again, the point is, he's not able to control his intention. It's too deep. نعم طريق اكتساب هذه النية مثلا أن يقوي أولا إيمانه بالشرع. Yes, of course, the path to acquiring this intention, in the case of this example, is that he should first of all strengthen his belief in the shara, in the revealed law. ويقوي إيمانه بعظم ثواب من يسعى في تكثير أمة محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم. And he should increase his faith in the great reward that comes to those who seek to increase the numbers of the Ummah of Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. ويدفع عن نفسه جميع المنفرات عن الولد. And he should push away from his mind all of the things that might deter him or might repel him from the idea of being a parent. من ثقل المؤنة وطول التعب وغيره. He might have been afraid of the expense and of the exhausting nature of parenthood and so forth. فإذا فعل ذلك ربما انبعثت من قلبه رغبة إلى تحصيل الولد للثواب. So when he's done that, then perhaps from his heart there might spontaneously arise a desire to bring children into the world in order to achieve reward. فتحركه تلك الرغبة. And that desire starts to move him. وتتحرك أعضاؤه لمباشرة العقد. And then he moves in order to enter into the marriage. فإذا انتهضت القدرة المحركة للسان بقبول العقد طاعة لهذا الباعث الغالب على القلب كان ناويا. And when the power which he has in order to move his tongue, whereby he says, I accept this contract out of obedience, if it's out of obedience to this motive that has been generated within himself, and this motive is predominant in his heart, only then does it become a niyyah, an intention. فإن لم يكن كذلك فما يقدره في نفسه ويردده في قلبه من قصد الولد وسواس وهذيان. But if it's not like that, then whatever he thinks he might have by way of an intention and whatever he might be saying to himself about why he's getting into the marriage is just whispering and vain talk. It's not real. So he's saying basically that our experience is that we can't actually manipulate our intentions because our intentions are what we truly mean by something, whether we like that meaning or not. But we can affect the reasons why we have intentions. So in this case, if I want to intend a marriage correctly and to have the merit of following the sunnah and of bringing children into the world rather than just satisfying desire, and I want to have that intention, I can't just say it, but instead I have to increase my love for the sunnah and I have to realize the great reward that happens in both worlds to those who follow the sunnah and the reward that attaches to those who make sacrifices in parenting, etc. When that becomes a reality within me, the intention happens. This is what he's saying. So we can't change our intentions, but we can change the circumstances which are the soil from which they grow. ولهذا امتنع جماعة من السلف من جملة من الطاعات. For this reason, quite a large number of the early Muslims refrained from certain acts of obedience to God. إذ لم تحضرهم النية, when the intention was simply not present within them. فكانوا يقولون ليس تحضرنا فيه نية. They used to say, there's no intention present with me. حتى إن ابن سيرين لم يصلي على جنازة الحسن البصري وقال ليس تحضرني نية. So Ibn Sirin, who was one of the great early Muslims of Iraq, didn't attend the janazah of Imam al-Hasan al-Basri, and he said, there's no intention present with me. And we find a lot of these stories in Imam al-Ghazali derived from the time of the early Muslims, and you realize how extraordinary they must have been, unlike a lot of Muslims nowadays who think that Islam is just a list of do's and don'ts, and that really is how you unlock the treasures of the next world and escape from hell. In fact, it's the do's and don'ts are there, but beneath the do's and don'ts there is the disposition of the heart, which is where the divine regard really reposes. So he gives us a lot of these stories about the early Muslims, and it's very important to realize the first 3 or so generations of Islam were not legalists and were not literalists, but depended so much on the interiority of their lives that sometimes they would miss out the good deed of going to somebody's janazah simply because they felt, well, the intention isn't there, so I shouldn't go. This doesn't apply to obligations, of course. It applies to optional acts of devotion. وَنَادَى بَعْضُهُمْ إِمْرَأَتَهُ. So he's going to give us more of these Salaf stories. And one of them once called to his wife, وَكَانَ يُسَرِّحُ شَعْرَهُ, while he was combing his hair, and هَاتِ الْمِدْرَى, bring the comb, it's a kind of round comb. فَقَالَتْ أَجِيءُ بِالْمِرْآةِ. The 2 words sound similar. Midrat, mir'ah, she's somewhere else. She says, shall I bring the mirror? فَسَكَتَ سَاعَةً ثُمَّ قَالَ نَعَمْ. And he went quiet, and then he said, yes, please. فَقِيلَ لَهُ فِي ذَلِكَ. Somebody asked him afterwards, maybe some other family member, about that. فَقَالَ كَانَ لِي فِي الْمِدْرَى نِيَّةٌ. I had an intention to get the comb. وَلَمْ تَحْضُرْنِي فِي الْمِرْآةِ نِيَّةٌ. I didn't have the intention of getting the mirror at that time. فَتَوَقَّفْتُ حَتَّى هَيَّأَهَا اللَّهُ تَعَالَى. And I stopped until Allah gave me the intention for the mirror. You see the incredible subtlety of the way in which they looked at themselves, even in these apparently sort of quotidian, trivial, domestic situations. Everything becomes divine and sacred because they're focusing so much on why they're doing things. Nothing is routinized in their lives. Everything is about, why am I doing this? Is this for God? Am I attentive? Am I hadir? ومات حماد ابن أبي سليمان وكان أحد علماء أهل الكوفة فقيل للثوري ألا تشهد جنازته فقال لو كان لي نية لفعلت. It's a similar story about 2 really famous hadith scholars. Hamad ibn Abi Sulaiman died. He was one of the ulama of the people of Kufa. And Sufyan al-Thawri was asked, aren't you going to his funeral? And he said, if I had the intention, I would go. وكانوا إذا سئلوا عملا من أعمال البر قالوا إن رزقنا الله تعالى نية فعلنا. And when they were asked to do something, one of the acts of goodness, they would say, if Allah bestows an intention upon me, I'll do it. Very different to the modern understanding of good deeds. One thinks, for instance, of charitable giving. There's dreadful fundraisers where everybody has been invited to hear some celebrity nasheed artist, and so they're kind of stuck in their seats. And then the charity fundraiser skips onto the stage and shows them an enormous picture of some child with leprosy. and tells them a terrible, tear-jerking story about how this child's life is going to end, look how much he's suffering. People kind of cough up. But that's not niyyah, that's not really niyyah of sadaqah, that's some other thing that's happening. So the way of the Salaf in that situation would not have been to respond. The fundraisers would then learn in a more civilized way, and inshallah more barakah-filled way of raising funds from the Muslims would emerge, rather than this emotional blackmail that seems to be prevailing in our community. But the early Muslims, yeah, they're quite unexpected always. Intention, purity, complete attachedness to one's relationship to God were why they did things. So more of these stories about the hadith narrators of the Salaf. وَكَانَ طَاوُوسٌ لَا يُحَدِّثُ إِلَّا بِنِيَّةٍ. Taus would only teach hadith with an intention. This is Taus bin Kaysan, who's a great Iranian scholar who was narrated a lot in Imam al-Bukhari. I think it's about 70 or 80 of his hadiths in al-Bukhari, and was a qadi for a while, and was close to Imam Ali Zain al-Abidin, and narrated some of his famous munajat, his quiet prayers. So one of the great ones of the Tabi'in, a disciple of Ibn Abbas. And he would only teach hadith when he had the intention for it. وَكَانَ يُسْأَلُ أَنْ يُحَدِّثَ فَلَا يُحَدِّث. Sometimes people would ask him for a hadith, and he wouldn't transmit the hadith. وَلَا يُسْأَلُ فَيَبْتَدِئُ. And sometimes he wasn't being asked for a hadith, and he would start narrating. فَقِيلَ لَهُ فِي ذَلِكَ. He was asked about that. قال أَفَتُحِبُّونَ أَنْ أُحَدِّثَ بِغَيْرِ نِيَّةٍ إِذَا حَضَرَتْنِي نِيَّةٌ فَعَلْتُ. Would you really want me, he would say, to teach hadith without a niyyah? When the niyyah comes, I teach. وحكي أن داود بن المحبر لما صنف كتاب العقل جاءه أحمد بن حنبل فطلبه منه. It's narrated that Dawood ibn al-Muhabbar, another early scholar, when he wrote his book Al-Aql, the mind, Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal came and asked to look at it. فَنَظَرَ فِيهِ أَحْمَدُ صَفْحًا فَرَدَّهُ. Ahmad looked through it and then gave it back. فَقَالْ مَالَكَ. So Ibn al-Muhabbar said, what's wrong? And he said, فِي أَحَادِيث ضِعَافٍ. There's weak hadith in it. فقال له داود أنا لم أخرجه على الأسانيد فأنظر فيه بعين الخبر. Dawood said, but I didn't narrate it as a technical hadith collection with isnads, but rather as something that is based on experience and wisdom. وإنما نظرت فيه بعين العمل فانتفعت. I looked at it in terms of the practical benefit of these narrations. I found that it was beneficial. قال أحمد فرده علي حتى أنظر فيه بالعين التي نظرت. Give it back to me so that I can read it with the eye with which you wrote it. فأخذه مكث عنده طويلا ثم قال جزاك الله خيرا فقد انتفعت به. And then he took it and spent some time reading it, gave it back and said, may Allah reward you, I've really benefited from this. So that's also important, and again, very characteristic of the early Muslims, that they would write different categories of books depending on whether the book was a formal text to be used in dalils for aqidah and sharia, in which case a certain isnad scholarship was required, and other cases in which hadith and other materials can be narrated for general benefit, targhib and tarhib, fada'il al-a'mal, good deeds. So Imam Ahmad understands this, but needs to see what was the intention in writing the book before he can really understand and appreciate it. وقيل للطاووس ادع لنا فقال حتى أجد له نية. Taus bin Kaysan again was once asked, can you pray for us? And he said, I will when I have the intention. He didn't want to do it just to please that person. That's not the right intention. It has to be a real intention coming from these deep factors so that it becomes a real prayer. And this is a very often part of the answer to the question we ask. I was praying and praying so much and Allah didn't answer. Why is that? Well, if the niyyah is not really present, then it's not really a prayer at all. It's just you expressing anxiety or telling yourself that you've prayed or some other thing. But the niyyah is this subtle fragrance that appears at certain moments that again you can't control. وقال بعضهم أنا في طلب نية لعيادة رجل منذ شهر فما صحت لي بعد. Another of the early Muslims said, I've been looking for the intention to visit somebody for a month, but I still don't have that intention. وقال عيسى بن كثير مشيت مع ميمون ابن مهران فلما انتهى إلى باب داره انصرفت فقال له ابنه ألا تعرض عليه العشاء؟ قال ليس من نيتي. Two more great hadith scholars. One is walking with the other, and when he came to his house, one of them went back, and the son said to the man whose house it was, aren't you going to invite him for dinner? He's walked with you all the way home. And he says, it's not my intention. So then the Imam explains all of this. وَهَذَا لِأَنَّ النِّيَّةَ تَتْبَعُ النَّظَرَ فإذا تغير النظر تغيرت النية وكانوا لا يرون أن يعملوا عملا إلا بنية. So this is because the intention follows the, as it were, perception that the soul has of a situation. And when that perception changes, the intention changes. And the early Muslims were of the view that they should only act with an intention. لِعِلْمِهِمْ بِأَنَّ النِّيَّةَ روح الأعمال, because of their knowledge that intention is the spirit of actions. وأن العمل بغير نية صادقة رياء وتكلف, and that to act without a sincere intention is ostentation and falsity. وهو سبب مقت لا سبب قرب, which is a reason for divine anger, not for divine nearness. وعلموا أن النية ليست هي قول القائل بلسانه نويت. They knew for sure that intention is not just what somebody says, I intend, بل هو انبعاث القلب يجري مجرى الفتوح من الله تعالى. It is something that wells up from the heart, which comes like an opening from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. فقد تتيسر في بعض الأوقات وقد تتعذر في بعضها. And this can become easy and natural in some situations and may simply not appear in others. So this seems like a strange teaching, doesn't it? And it's characteristic of the absolute sincerity of the early Muslims, that they would only do good things if they knew that their reason was good, even if people thought they were eccentric, or even if they thought maybe this is rude, but because they all understood each other and understood this world and knew that these are not unethical people, but people who have a great close connection to Allah, then these strange, almost dervish-like exceptions and oddities were pretty normal. And this is one of the beautiful things you find if you read the stories of the early Muslims, that this sincerity made them, in a certain worldly way, quite unconventional and strange. Na'am. So we're thinking, oh, how often does this actually happen? نعم من كان الغالب على قلبه أمر الدين تيسر عليه في أكثر الأحوال إحضار النية للخيرات. Of course, the Imam says, whoever finds in his heart that religion is the predominant principle, in most circumstances the intention for good things will be present. فإن قلبه مائل بالجملة إلى أصل الخير, because his heart is fundamentally inclined by its nature to the basis of good deeds. فينبعث إلى التفاصيل غالبا, and if the basis is good, then normally the details will follow. ومن مال قلبه إلى الدنيا وغلبت عليه لم يتيسر له ذلك. But whoever finds that in his heart the dunya is the most important principle, the dominant principle, that won't come easily. بل لا يتيسر له في الفرائض إلا بجهد جهيد. And a good intention, even for obligations, won't come easily except in the context of great effort. وغايته أن يتذكر النار ويحذر نفسه عقابها. And the most, in the case of somebody who's basically a worldly person, the most that such a person can experience is that he remembers the punishment of hell. أو نعيم الجنة ويرغب نفسه فيها, and so he constantly tells himself to crave paradise. فَرُبَّمَا تَنْبَعِثُ لَهُ دَاعِيَ ضَعِيفًا, and maybe a weak motive will arise in the heart of such a worldly person. فَيَكُونُ ثَوَابُهُ بِقَدْرِ رَغْبَتِهِ وَنِيَّتِهِ, and his reward will be in proportion to the intensity and the sincerity of his desire. وأما الطاعة على نية إجلال الله تعالى لاستحقاقه الطاعة والعبودية. As for acts of obedience, which are done with the intention simply of glorifying God, because He is worthy of obedience and service, فلا تتيسر للراغب في الدنيا. This doesn't come easily to someone who loves the world. وهذه أعز النيات وأعلاها. This is the highest and the rarest of intentions. ويعز على بسيط الأرض من يفهمها فضلا عمن يتعاطاها. And it's unusual to find, walking on the face of the earth, somebody who even understands this, let alone somebody who practices it. والنيات الناس في الطاعات أقسام. People's intentions when doing good deeds fall in different categories. إذ منهم من يكون عمله إجابة لباعث الخوف. Some people find that their actions come about through the motive of fear. فإنه يتقي النار. Basically, what drives him to do good deeds in religion is that he doesn't want to go to hell. ومنهم من يعمل إجابة لباعث الرجاء. Other people are primarily driven by the motive of hope. وهو الرغبة في الجنة. This is desire for paradise. وهذا وإن كان نازلا بالإضافة إلى قصد طاعة الله وتعظيمه لذاته ولجلاله لا لأمر سواه فهو من جملة النيات الصحيحة. And these two things, even if they're not as high as the person who worships simply in order to glorify Almighty God and to magnify Him, and not for any other reason, they're still considered to be valid intentions. لأنه ميل إلى الموعود في الآخرة وإن كان من جنس المألوفات في الدنيا, because they are an inclination towards that which is promised in the next world, even if those otherworldly things seem to be very analogous to the things that we hope for or fear in this world. وأغلب البواعث باعث الفرج والبطن وموضع قضاء وطرهما الجنة. Most people are driven by a desire for food and sex, and they conceive of paradise as something that motivates them because they think that that can continue in the next world. This is a valid intention, but it's not the highest of the possible spiritual intentions that we can have, but it's still acceptable. So he goes on, وَأَمَّا عِبَادَةُ ذَوِي الْأَلْبَابِ. As for the ibadah of the people of purified hearts, فلا تجاوز ذكر الله تعالى والفكر فيه حبا لجماله وجلاله. This ibadah is based on remembering Allah, thinking about Allah, out of love for his beauty and for his majesty. وَسَائِرُ الْأَعْمَالِ تَكُونُ مُؤَكِّدَاتٍ وَرَوَادِفٍ. And all of the other actions are things that emphasize that and follow from it. وَهَؤُلَاء أَرْفَعُ دَرَجَةً مِنَ الْإِلْتِفَاتِ إِلَى الْمَنْكُوحِ وَالْمَطْعُومِ فِي الْجَنَّةِ. And those people tend to find that there is no preoccupation with marriage and the food of paradise because they're just focused on the glory and the beauty of Almighty God. Those things are valid, but they've found that which is higher, just as the ru'ya, the vision of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in paradise, is the highest degree and not given to everybody. وحكي أن أحمد بن خضروي رأى ربه تعالى في المنام فقال له كل الناس يطلبون مني الجنة إلا أبا يزيد فإنه يطلبني. It's a story of one of the early Sufis that he saw his Lord in a dream, and his Lord said, all the people are asking me for paradise except Abu Yazid, this absolutely intention, ikhlas focused believer, because he's searching for me, he's looking for me. ورأى أبو يزيد ربه في المنام فقال يا رب كيف الطريق إليك فقال اترك نفسك وتعال. Abu Yazid, after his death, was seen in a dream. Abu Yazid saw his Lord in a dream and said, "O my Lord, what is the road to you?" And he said, "Leave yourself and come." So this is for people who are deeply involved in ibadah, the higher degree. There is the incentivizing degree of paradise and the fire, and that is entirely legitimate, and it is a truth. But it is a step that brings us into the deeper aspect of ibadah, which is lillah subhanahu wa ta'ala, just because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone deserves to be worshipped. ومعرفة هذه الحقائق تورث أعمالا وأفعالا يستنكرها الظاهريون من الفقهاء. And an understanding of these realities generates actions which exoteric jurists can't understand and may even reject. فإننا نقول من حضرت له نية في مباح ولم تحضر في فضيلة فالمباح أولى وانتقلت الفضيلة إليه. Imam Ghazali, the great master of fiqh, says here, whoever has a niyyah for something permissible, I intend to do this thing and I have a good divine intention for it, and he doesn't have an intention for something that is not an obligation but is religiously beneficial, say fasting on a special day, it is actually preferable for him to do the thing for which he does have a niyyah. And the merit is transferred to that thing. In other words, it's better to do a neutral thing for a good reason than to do a good thing without having a particular reason or a strong intention for doing it, so that's just a kind of automated action. وصارت الفضيلة في حقه نقيصة. And in that context, the meritorious act, as judged by the fuqaha, becomes less meritorious than that mubah action. فَإِنَّ الْأَعْمَالَ بِالنِّيَّاتِ. Actions are by intentions. So here he's taking a further step, and again reminding us that religion is not legalism, particularly when we look at the Islam of the early generations, that they would not attend the janazah of Al-Hasan al-Basri because the intention wasn't there. But they might do things that are just kind of neutral if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has granted them a purified and a purifying intention at that time. And it's really very important for us to grasp this, because ours is an age in which legalism to some people seems to be the obvious interpretation of religion. You perform this good deed, there will be a consequence in the next world. Well, one is not treating the divine as some kind of algorithm, as if you are putting a shilling in the chocolate machine and you get out the bar of chocolate as a kind of automated procedure. That would be a very strange reason for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to create the world. The world is created for what is within the world, for akhlaq, for niyyah, for adab, for human excellence. It is about akhlaq. And this is gigantically important to understand. And to have good akhlaq, even with a kind of moderate level of external religiosity, is far better than to have a lot of religiosity but to be a kind of rude and distasteful person. And this is one of the things that Imam Ghazali is constantly emphasizing, which we tend to miss nowadays because of our focus on externals, which comes, I think, partly just because we're in decadent times and people are not naturally very spiritual any longer and look at the surface of things, but partly also because we are from a materialistic civilization that in a Newtonian way likes to see cause and effect in everything, and so we read these things that are to do with our transaction for the next world as though they were kind of analogous to what we find on the pages of an engineering or a medical textbook. If you do A, then B will ensue. Well, when you're talking about your relationship to the transcendent, that is by definition not of this world, when you're talking about your aptitude for what is the next world and therefore not of this world, well, those mechanical analogies are not going to operate. Allah says that He provides for whomsoever He wills, بِغَيْرِ حِسَاب, without reckoning. And there is no economy of salvation. And this is evident in the first hadith of Islam, al-a'malu bin-niyat, actions are by intention. And you could say that the entire purpose of Imam al-Ghazali is, in this book, the internalizing of that message and to snap us out of this dreadful habit that we have of thinking, well, I went and I prayed Maghrib and I guess I made the intention and I guess, alhamdulillah, that's another point on my scorecard for the akhirah. Religion would be a very strange thing if that were the case. For Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to have created the majesty of the heavens and the earth and the jinn and the shayateen and Bani Adam and the Anbiya, if all that it was about was this kind of algebra. No, it isn't. It's not about externals. There are externals. The Sharia is binding, but what we mean by those things is what judgment is really about. يَوْمَ لَا يَنْفَعُ مَالٌ وَلَا بَنُونَ إِلَّا مَنْ أَتَى اللَّهَ بِقَلْبٍ سَلِيمٍ. On the day when neither wealth nor offspring benefit us, what benefits us is coming to Allah with a sound heart. This is the mahal al-nazar al-ilahi. This is where the divine regard descends and focuses on, not so much on what we do, but how we are. And religion becomes decadent very quickly when it's externalized. It just becomes a matter of literal compliance. Now, Imam Ghazali may be the greatest Shafi'i jurist ever, author of the Mustasfa, knows exactly all of the fiqh and magnifies the fiqh. Where would Shafi'i fiqh be without Imam Ghazali? But the greatness of the man is that he is a jurist, but he's not a legalist. Maybe a legalist, but not a legalist. Because he knows that the world is not just about Allah setting up this complex minefield of forbidden things and things that He wants us to do, and that's what all of creation is about. No, it's much more interesting than that, and it's about the inward process of return to Him whom we remember in our inwardness, but not in our outwardness at the day of Alastu bi Rabbikum. So let's continue then with the chapter. ومثل أن يكون له نية في الأكل والشرب والنوم ليريح نفسه ويتقوى على العبادة في المستقبل، وليس تنبعث نيته في الحال للصوم والصلاة، فالأكل والنوم هو الأفضل له. Look at what he's saying. It's like somebody who has an intention to eat and to drink and to sleep because he needs the rest and he needs to be strong so that in future he can continue his religious life. But he doesn't have, at that time, the niyyah for fasting and prayer. In that situation, eating and sleeping are better for him. Even though eating and sleeping, they're kind of mubah, neutral actions. But in that situation, they become better for him. Why? Because he has the intention. He intends to do those things for a good purpose. بل لو مل العبادة لمواظبته عليها وسكن نشاطه وضعفت رغبته وعلم أن لو ترفه ساعة باللهو وحديث عاد نشاطه. He says, even if somebody becomes a little bit fatigued in worship, in persisting in worship, and his energy levels decline, and his desire for it becomes weaker, and he knows that if he relaxes for an hour by lahu, some entertainment, amusing himself, and by chatting to somebody, ada nishato, if he does that, if he takes a break, his energy will be restored. فَاللَّهْوُ وَالْحَدِيثُ أَفْضَلُ لَهُ مِنَ الصَّلَاةِ. Then amusing himself and talking to friends is better for him than praying. قال أبو الدرداء إني لأستجم نفسي بشيء من اللهو فيكون ذلك عونا لي على الحق. Abu Darda, one of the great Sahabas, says, I sometimes indulge myself with some play, some lahu, some distraction, so that this makes it easier for me to approach the truth. And there's sayings like this reported of a number of the early Muslims. Ibn Mas'ud is reported as saying, إِنِّي لَا أَشْتَغِلُ بِبَعْضِ الْبَاطِلِ لِأَلَّا يَمَلَّ قَلْبِي عَنِ الْحَقِّ. Sometimes I busy myself with some batil thing, something that's just playing a game with friends or something, so that my heart will not become bored of truth. Because it's human nature. Sometimes we become bored. So there's circumstances in which relaxing and taking it easy, going for a holiday or whatever, is actually better for you than doing some religious thing. Should I do 40 days gasht with the Tablighi Jamaat? Or should I go to Torquay and relax? You have to consult yourself. It may well be that you can have a better niyyah for relaxing in order to strengthen your religious life and staying sane, then if you do all of these kind of intense things over and over again that make everybody think, mashallah, mashallah, is always doing this stuff. It's not like that. Religion is very sane. Sometimes we need our downtime, and there can be a good intention for that that is actually better than praying. وقال علي كرم الله وجهه روحوا القلوب فإنها إذا أكرهت عميت. Give some relaxation to your hearts, because when they are compelled consciously, they go blind. This is Imam Ali, the master of Futuwa, saying this. It's human nature that we cannot constantly burden ourselves, even with good deeds. We just can't do it. And the intention is going to be the first thing that weakens. And so Imam Ali is saying, Rawih al-qulub, kind of relax your hearts. Get some downtime, relax for a bit. Otherwise your hearts will turn blind, he says. And this is a warning, I guess, against a kind of fanaticism and an excessive intensiveness in religion. If I do more prayers and I do more fasting and more and more and more, and I never stop, and if I take time off, then that's some kind of dreadful concession. That's not how it is. that's destructive. This is the wisdom and the balance of religion, that we must not think that the more stuff we do, automatically the better we are. It can actually damage us. It can turn our hearts blind. وهذه دقائق لا يدركها إلا سماسرة العلماء. These are subtleties only perceived by the truly great scholars. دون الحشوية منهم, and not the hashwiya amongst them. Who are the hashwiya? This is a term for a particular category of legalist hadith enthusiast, largely in Baghdad, in and before Imam al-Ghazali's day. Those who are literalists, fundamentalists, if you like, zealots, who haven't read the sound hadith, halak al-mutanatti'un, may the fanatics perish. The Holy Prophet says, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, ma yashadu ad-dinu ahadan illa ghalaba. Religion never becomes too much for somebody without overpowering him. The overpowering can be psychological consequences or some kind of depression or a breakdown, and just human nature, that there's a limit to how much we can carry of these actions. But also hashwiya has the sense of people who are doing things only on the surface and there's nothing behind the surface. Hashu means stuffing in Arabic. It's like the narrow-minded zealots of early Islam came from Najd, which is a region of central Arabia. And tanjid in Arabic actually means upholstery, which is said to refer to the fact that these were zealots for whom the Quran was not deeply within them, but just on the surface. Inside, it's just kind of styrofoam or something. But they seem to be kind of big and firm, but no, there's nothing really there. So this is what the Imam means, and the ulama mean when they speak of the hashwiya, ultra-literalists. God says that he sits on the throne, and there really is a throne, and it's really big, and we don't know how many kilometers exactly, but that's a kind of literalism that is obviously likely to make religion absurd, as well as leading to all kinds of psychological and behavioral disorders amongst them. So in Imam al-Ghazali's day, those people, who were not very many, but did exist, were called the hashwiya. So the hashwiya, they don't understand this business of, sometimes it's better to take a holiday with a niyyah than to do a whole bunch of extra prayers and fasts without the niyyah. Don't push yourself too hard. The hashwiya can't understand that. بل الحاذق بالطب قد يعالج المحرور باللحم مع حرارته. A really good doctor, a physician, he says, when confronted by a patient that has a high temperature, might treat him with meat, which is a heating element, which normally would be expected to make him even hotter. ويستبعده القاصر في الطب. And the beginning medical student would think that sounds far-fetched. وإنما يبتغي به أن يعيد أولا قوته ليحتمل المعالجة بالضد. But the great doctor's intention is only for that person to regain his strength so that he can then be strong enough to support treatment with something that will cool him down again. So this meat is going to kind of strengthen him as well as maybe heating him up a little bit. But that strength will mean that when the other treatment, the main treatment comes, he's going to be strong enough to do that. So sometimes we need to do counterintuitive things in order to be strong enough to carry the yoke of the law. والحاذق في لعب الشطرنج مثلا قد ينزل عن الرخ والفرس مجانا ليتوصل بذلك إلى الغلبة. A good chess player, he says, might well sacrifice his rook. Interestingly, rook is actually from the Arabic. Imam al-Ghazali is saying ruh here because the game comes from the Middle East. So the great chess player might make a gambit whereby he sacrifices his rook and his knight for nothing in exchange. He's not capturing any of his opponent's players in order to achieve victory in the longer term. وَالضَّعِيفُ الْبَصِيرَ قَدْ يَضْحَكُ بِهِ. And the amateur watching this might laugh at him. وَيَتَعَجَّبْ مِنْهُ, and be amazed. What's the point of this sacrifice? وَكَذَلِكَ الْخَبِيرُ بِالْقِتَالِ. Similarly, with the experienced warrior, قَدْ يَفِرُّ بَيْنَ يَدَيِ قَرِينِهِ. He might run away from his opponent. He's on the field of battle, sword to sword. He might flee. وَيُوَلِّيهِ دُبُرَهُ حِيلَةً مِنْ. Turn his back on him, run away from him, as a stratagem of war. لِيَسْتَجِرَّهُ إِلَى مَضِيقٍ فَيَكِرَّ عَلَيْهِ فَيَقْهَرَهُ. In order to take him into a narrow valley and then suddenly turn around and defeat him. So Imam Ghazali here is using these strategic analogies to indicate that sometimes we need to take a step back in order to jump better. Reculer pour mieux sauter. And this is often not understood by religionists, and sometimes people do get into quite bad states when they're told by the hashwiyah that the more ibadah you do, the better it is, mashallah, and do this and do that. It can sometimes be overwhelming for new converts who end up kind of snapping out of everything because it's just too heavy too soon. Or just established Muslims who are trying to get back into the mosque, and they're just endlessly told with browbeating, fire-eating sermons that they have to do so much. No, there's a lot of wisdom in this, even though you can see Imam al-Ghazali's treatment about niyyah is quite frightening, really, because what is the value of all of the things that we're doing? How many of the thousands of prayers that we've made have really had this intention that we can't control really present? It's rather a sobering thought. But this is not a text of hopeless utopian extremism, because here he's giving us this wisdom that says the good news about this intention business is that whenever an intention floats into yourself, so you suddenly think, it would really be good to go and visit so-and-so, that can be better for you than doing an extra 2 rak'ahs when you've not got a particularly strong niyyah. And this really humanizes religion, and this is why the early Muslims were so great, precisely because they weren't literalists and they didn't have this mechanical understanding of how the Sunnah and the Sharia works. وَكَذَلِكَ سُلُوكُ طَرِيقِ اللَّهِ تَعَالَى كُلُّهُ قِتَالٌ مَعَ الشَّيْطَانِ. Thus it is, after giving this military analogy. Treading Allah's path is all fighting, sword fight with the shaitan. وَمُعَالَجَةٌ لِلْقَلْبِ, and an attempt to heal the heart. وَالْبَصِيرُ الْمُوَفَّقِ يَقِفُ فِيهَا عَلَى لَطَائِفٍ مِنَ الْحِيَلِ يَسْتَبْعِدُهَا الضُّعَفَاءِ. And the person who is perceptive and given divine success will realize and will perceive subtle maneuvers in this battle, which to the weak-minded might seem far-fetched. فَلَا يَنْبَغِي لِلْمُرِيدِ أَنْ يُضْمِرَ إِنْكَارًا عَلَى مَا يَرَاهُ مِنْ شَيْخِهِ. So a pupil, and here's talking particularly about the pupil-teacher relationship in the context of Sufism, it's not appropriate for the disciple to harbour within himself a denial of some of the things that he sees from his teacher. وَلَا لِلْمُتَعَلِّمْ أَنْ يَعْتَرِضَ عَلَى أُسْتَاذِهِ. And it's not right for the student to object inappropriately to his teacher. بَلْ يَنْبَغِي أَنْ يَقِفَ عِنْدَ حَدِّ بَصِيرَتِهِ. He must recognize his own ignorance and stop at the boundaries of what he can understand. وَمَا لَا يَفْهَمُهُ مِنْ أَحْوَالِهِمَا يُسَلِّمُهُ لَهُمَا إِلَى أَنْ يَنْكَشِفَ لَهُ أَسْرَارُ ذَلِكَ. And he will benefit from simply waiting until the secrets for these things become clear. بِأَنْ يَبْلُغَ رُتْبَتَهُمَا, when he reaches their level. وَيَنَالُ دَرَجَتُهُمَا وَمِنَ اللَّهِ حُسْنُ التَّوْفِيقِ. And from Allah is the beauty of tawfiq. So this is the way in which he's ending. And again, it reminds us that in the context of spiritual direction, where you can still find this, and the initiatic dimension of religion is all but unknown to so many contemporary Muslims. In that context, obviously, if the Shaykh is engaged in Sharia violations, then he's not a Shaykh at all, he's an Iblis, and you head for the door and take a ghusl, because that's bad news. But if he seems to be not praying so many sunnah prayers, if he doesn't do awabin the way the guy down the road does, but there's other stuff going on that seems counterintuitive, morally not inappropriate, but startling, then that is the way in which the Shaykh is teaching, and this is the basis of spiritual instruction in Islam, is that it's often confronting us with what is unexpected, and often humour comes into it, because humour is one of the mysteries of the human mind, really, what constitutes humour. It has something to do with a credible incongruity, and credible incongruities can be quite good at making us think about things. There's a wisdom in a lot of humour, not just in the taking down of people's egotism, which is often a form of humour, laughing about the qadi, that kind of thing, pomposity, deflated, but also the kind of strangeness of the world. And very often you find that this example of the early Muslim set of doing things that seem startling is something that is transmitted down to the present day in the circles of the great ulama, and one can be often surprised, and as a result jolted out of one's sort of comatose complacency by seeing startling things. And as I said, they can't be Sharia violations. And if they seem to be, then you have to ask and find out. And if they are Sharia violations, and there's no spiritual benefit in anything that is against the commands of Allah and His Messenger. But there can be a lot of things, a lot of uproar, a lot of startling stories in the circles of the great ulama, which are there in order to wake people up and to put them in that state where the good niyyah is more likely to come. And this, when you think about it, is critically important work. And part of the misfortune of today's ummah is that those contexts are hard to find. And so much of religion, including religion in the Western diaspora, has become automated. That people go to the mosque because they've always gone to the mosque, and that's what they did in the village back home in Egypt or wherever, and they want everything there to be the way it was back in the village and the same kind of values, and it's a kind of repetition of things. And the intention might actually be just to repeat things. The intention might be even malignant, in that the mosque might be established deliberately in opposition to another mosque. And there's so much tribalism, so much ethnocentrism, so much sectarianism in Muslim communities in the West that are threatened in various ways and really ought to be standing together, that the question arises as to, following Imam al-Ghazali's example, as to, is it better to pray in those mosques if you're travelling, for instance, you're changing trains, there's the minaret, you go to the mosque, and it's a very sectarian kind of space, and people are looking at you with suspicion and disapproval, and you're going to pray your rak'ahs. Is that actually better for you, or is it better just to pray in the park next door? This is the kind of point that the Salaf are guiding us to here. Don't get into a kind of automated view. I have to attend the masjid and this. No, it's about the quality of the interior life. And if a mosque is established not for taqwa, but for the furtherance of a particular ethnic sodality, then what's the point of going there? And it's becoming a crisis in a lot of Muslim communities in the West, where people feel the need for a real interior life, because certainly the secular society can't provide that. But the mosque seems primarily dominated by dubious intentions and furious propping up of the threatened ego by denouncing other groups. The Masjid al-Dirar phenomenon is very widespread. So one of the conversations that we need to be having as Muslims in the West is the extent to which there are actually mosques at all. If the word for mosque is jami', which means inclusive, but the intention behind those mosques is to further a particular sectarian or ethnic identity. Well, is it better to pray somewhere else? To pray at home? Imam Malik used to pray at home and not in the haram in Medina, because there are certain things that affected his inner life that he didn't approve of when he went in there, and it affected his niyyah. Well, this is something that we need to think about. But the main lesson that we've learned, inshallah, from this fifth bayan in the book of niyyah is that actions are by intentions. Doesn't affect legality in public law, but it by and large. But in the context of our ibadah, which is kind of the essence of our transaction with our Lord, makes everything very subtle and interiorizes everything. So in a healthy Muslim community, what the conversation tends to focus on is stories of really wonderful people and praise of people for their akhlaq, and a dislike of backbiting and a respect for adab. In decadent Muslim communities, it's fatwa wars and the discussion of externals and the discussion of groups that one doesn't approve of and ways in which that group might be getting stronger or weaker. And this is a measurement of the health of Muslim communities, and we should apply that yardstick to ourselves, first of all, but also to the communities that we engage with. And this is one of the essential teachings of Imam al-Ghazali, and alhamdulillah it's liberative, because those cult-like environments tend to be forms of incarceration, really. Those mosques are like prisons, and it's very hard for people to spread their wings and really to be free, which is what the interiorization of Islam is offering us. This is the way of itlaq, of freedom. It's not the way of choosing to be incarcerated. So, alhamdulillah, we've come to the end of this section, and I think instead of pressing on with the second of the three thirds of the book of niyyah, and moving into the question of ikhlas, we will stop at this point and inshallah think about what we have learned, because the Imam is telling us some home truths about why we do things. And if we're going to do tens of thousands of rakahs in our lives, it's worth thinking about intention. And if the intention is not good, thinking about what the Imam is telling us, to the effect that you can't actually change your intention. And if you think you've done so, then you're kidding yourself. But you can change the subsoil from which those intentions bubble up into the surface level. And so a deep work is required, which is beyond the capacity of fiqh and beyond the capacity of aqidah, but which is to do with tazkiyah and tasawwuf and the inner rectification. So we see here the fundamental root principle that Imam al-Ghazali is reaching for, that this is bringing life to the sciences of religion by restoring to them their spirit and their purpose. So may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant us all good niyyahs, and grant us basira, and grant us the gift of not judging others or things in the world by appearances, by having a good intention of everybody, inshallah, and by resurrecting us according to Allah's generosity towards us, not according to our actions or our intentions, because He is Al-Kareem. Ameen, Ya Rabbil Alameen. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.